Imagine waking up at 2:30 in the morning. You check your phone, still half asleep, expecting the usual notifications, messages, maybe a news alert about markets or politics. But instead, the first headline you see freezes you instantly. United States and Israel launch massive coordinated strikes on Iran. Cities are shaking, air defenses are lighting up the sky. And somewhere in one of the most critical waterways on Earth, more than 150 oil tankers carrying the fuel that powers the global economy have suddenly stopped moving. This is not a movie. This is not a military exercise. This is a real geopolitical earthquake unfolding in real time. And before the story is over, you will understand exactly why Vladimir Putin is furious, why gasoline prices around the world could surge dramatically, and why the next 30 days could reshape the balance of power in the international system. Because the most shocking part of this entire crisis is something that almost nobody is talking about yet. How the world reached this moment. To understand the magnitude of what just happened, we need to go back. For years, Iran had been walking a geopolitical tightrope. On one side, Tehran was quietly expanding elements of its nuclear infrastructure, enriching uranium, developing longer-range ballistic missiles, and strengthening its network of regional proxy groups. These groups stretched across the Middle East, from Hamas in Gaza to Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Houthi movement operating in Yemen. Each of these actors represented a different piece of Iran's broader regional strategy. On the other side of the tightrope, Iran was participating in diplomatic negotiations. Across conference tables in places like Geneva, Iranian diplomats met with Western officials to discuss nuclear limits, sanctions relief, and regional security. Round after round of negotiations followed a familiar pattern. Statements about de-escalation, diplomatic smiles for cameras, carefully worded press conferences. But behind the scenes, something very different was happening. The intelligence war behind the diplomacy. While public negotiations continued, intelligence agencies in Washington and Tel Aviv were monitoring every development. Satellite imagery tracked construction at Iranian facilities. Signals intelligence intercepted communications between military units. Cyber teams monitored digital infrastructure tied to Iran's missile and nuclear programs. Gradually, analysts began to build a picture. From their perspective, Iran was not slowing its strategic programs. It was accelerating them. Officials inside both governments increasingly believed they were watching a long-term strategic buildup, one that could eventually alter the balance of power across the Middle East. For years, that concern remained inside classified briefings, but then something changed. The night, everything shifted. The message was direct. He argued that Iran posed a growing threat to American security and to U.S. allies in the region. He referenced Iran's missile programs, its support for regional militant groups, and what he described as years of deceptive diplomacy. During the address, he acknowledged something that made the gravity of the situation unmistakable. Military action was already underway. The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost, he said, and we may have casualties. That often happens in war. By the time that video reached millions of viewers, the operation had already begun. 2 operations, 1 massive assault. Israel's military campaign carried the codename Operation Roaring Lion. The American campaign was named Operation Epic Fury. Together, they formed a coordinated strike package targeting multiple locations across Iran. Major cities and military regions were hit almost simultaneously. Among the reported targets were Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah. The objective was not random bombardment. The strikes focused on military command centers, missile facilities, security headquarters, and infrastructure linked to strategic weapons programs. The scale was enormous. Stealth bombers from the United States Air Force were deployed against hardened missile infrastructure. According to statements from United States Central Command, commonly known as CENTCOM, the goal was to dismantle elements of Iran's military command network. In other words, this was not simply a warning strike. It was designed to significantly degrade Iran's ability to coordinate military operations, the leadership shockwave. Then came the moment that sent shockwaves across global politics. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was reportedly killed during the strikes. For more than 3 decades, Khamenei had been the central figure in Iran's political and religious leadership structure. His authority shaped the country's foreign policy, military posture, and ideological direction. The destruction of his compound and the reported deaths within his inner circle created immediate uncertainty about Iran's chain of command. Senior Iranian officials reportedly convened emergency meetings. National mourning ceremonies were discussed. Government institutions moved quickly to project stability, but the reality was clear. One of the most powerful leadership figures in the Middle East had suddenly been removed from the political stage. A call to the streets. Shortly afterward, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appeared in interviews urging the Iranian public to protest against the ruling system. He encouraged citizens to demand political change. The message was unmistakable. The strikes were intended not only to damage military capabilities, but also to create internal pressure within Iran itself. At that moment, the entire region entered a tense waiting period. Because history had shown something repeatedly. Iran rarely leaves attacks unanswered, and analysts everywhere were asking the same question. How would Tehran respond? The stakes are much bigger than missiles. Before we even get to Iran's retaliation, there is something critical to understand. This crisis is not only about airstrikes, drones, or missiles. It is about energy. It is about trade routes. And it is about the fragile financial architecture that supports the global economy. At the center of that system sits a narrow strip of water known as the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this corridor. Every day, tankers carrying energy shipments to Asia, Europe, and North America travel through it. If that route becomes unsafe, or even uncertain, global markets react instantly. Oil prices rise, shipping insurance spikes, and governments around the world begin calculating the economic fallout. That is why what happened next mattered so much. Because when Iran finally responded, it did not only aim at military targets, it aimed at the global economic system itself. Iran did not wait. Within hours of the first strikes, Tehran announced the beginning of Operation True Promise to 4, the largest retaliatory campaign the country had ever launched. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles were fired almost simultaneously across the region. The targets stretched across 9 countries: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. American military bases were among the intended targets. Israeli cities were also threatened. But what shocked global markets instantly was something else. Iran began striking the Gulf's critical energy infrastructure. The message to the Gulf missiles and drones moved toward the heart of the Gulf's economic system. The capital of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, came under threat. Saudi Arabia's eastern province, the region that houses many of the world's most vital oil installations, was struck as well. The area also includes strategic military installations like King Abdulaziz Air Base. In the United Arab Emirates, the situation escalated rapidly. At Dubai International Airport, several staff members were injured during emergency responses as missile interceptors lit up the night sky. Meanwhile, at Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi, fragments from intercepted missiles reportedly fell near the outer perimeter of the airport. Even more symbolic was what happened near Palm Jumeirah, one of the most famous man-made islands in the world and a global symbol of Gulf prosperity. Debris from an intercepted missile fell onto a nearby building, igniting a fire that emergency crews raced to contain. These were not random strikes. They were strategic signals. Iran was sending a message to every Gulf government that it allowed American forces to operate from bases on their soil. No location in the region was beyond reach. Casualties across the region. The human toll began to mount quickly. 3 people were reported killed in the UAE. At least 3 more lost their lives in Kuwait. In Jordan, the armed forces intercepted dozens of drones and missiles, but fragments from destroyed projectiles still rained down in several areas, causing property damage and sending civilians scrambling for shelter. The conflict was expanding faster than anyone expected. Then another front reopened. The northern front ignites. In Lebanon, the militant organization Hezbollah launched rockets and drones toward northern Israel. The attacks were framed as retaliation for the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. For months, that border had remained relatively quiet after earlier rounds of conflict. Now it was active again. What had begun as a limited strike campaign was rapidly transforming into a multi-front regional confrontation. But the most frightening developments were not happening on land. They were unfolding in the waters of the Persian Gulf. The tankers that suddenly stopped. 2 oil tankers operating in international waters off the coast of Oman were directly targeted. One vessel, flying the flag of Palau, was hit. Another registered in the Marshall Islands was also struck. Neither incident sank a ship, but they achieved something strategically more powerful. They terrified the shipping industry. Within hours, approximately 150 freight vessels, many of them massive oil tankers, stopped moving entirely. Engines idling, crews waiting anxiously, all of them positioned outside one narrow maritime corridor that controls the energy lifeline of the planet. That corridor is the Strait of Hormuz, the 21 miles that power the world. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, but through that narrow gap flows an astonishing amount of global energy. Every single day, around 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it. Roughly 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas exports travels through the same corridor. Energy shipments heading to Asia, Europe, and beyond must pass through this route. If the strait becomes unsafe, or even just too expensive to insure, the global economy begins to feel the impact almost immediately. Oil prices surge, natural gas prices follow, Airlines face higher fuel costs, pushing ticket prices upward within weeks. Factories pay more for energy. Agricultural supply chains feel pressure because both fuel and fertilizer depend heavily on petroleum. And since energy costs are embedded in almost every product produced, transported, or sold anywhere on Earth, inflation spreads rapidly across the entire system. Markets begin to react. This is not theoretical. Economists have warned about this exact chain reaction for decades. With tankers stalled and the conflict showing no immediate sign of calming, financial markets began pricing in the worst-case scenarios. Stock markets dropped in early trading sessions. Emerging market currencies weakened as investors rushed towards safer assets. Energy-importing nations faced the most immediate risk. Countries such as India, Pakistan, Japan, and much of Europe depend heavily on imported fuel. For ordinary households, the implications are straightforward. Higher fuel prices, higher food prices, higher borrowing costs if central banks are forced to raise interest rates to control inflation. A conflict thousands of kilometers away can suddenly affect the price of groceries or transportation anywhere in the world. The triple-digit oil scenario. If the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz lasts more than a few weeks, some analysts believe crude oil could easily move above $100 per barrel. That threshold is psychologically and economically significant. The last time oil remained at those levels for extended periods, many economies experienced a form of economic stagnation combined with high inflation, often called stagflation. Today, the global economy may be even more vulnerable. Governments are still carrying large debt loads from the pandemic era. Interest rates in many countries remain elevated, and financial systems are already under pressure from slowing growth. In that environment, a prolonged energy shock could ripple across industries worldwide. The view from Moscow. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, one leader has been watching these events unfold with particular attention: Vladimir Putin. For Moscow, the situation is complicated. In January 2025, Russia and Iran signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. The two countries had already been strengthening ties for years. Russia had assisted Iran in building nuclear reactors. Iran had provided drones and other technologies used in modern warfare. Trade between the two nations had grown into the tens of billions of dollars. From Moscow's perspective, Iran was a critical strategic partner. And then, in the span of a single weekend, that partner experienced a devastating blow. Its supreme leader eliminated, its military infrastructure heavily damaged, and its regional environment suddenly on the brink of a wider war. For Putin, the crisis raises difficult strategic questions. Should Russia support Iran more openly? Should it avoid deeper involvement to prevent confrontation with the United States? Or should it quietly take advantage of the situation, particularly if disruptions in Gulf energy exports increase demand for Russian oil and gas? These questions are now being debated behind closed doors in the Kremlin. Because the outcome of this conflict will not only shape the Middle East, it could reshape the global balance of power. Imagine waking up at exactly 2:30 in the morning. The world outside is quiet. Your phone lights up beside your bed. Out of curiosity, you check the screen, and the first headline you see freezes you in place. United States and Israel launch massive coordinated strikes on Iran. At first, it feels unreal, like something pulled from a movie script. But then the alerts keep coming. Cities shaking under missile impacts, military installations burning, and somewhere in the Persian Gulf, more than 150 oil tankers carrying the lifeblood of the global economy have suddenly stopped moving. The ships are not sunk. They are not destroyed. They are simply waiting, frozen in the water, because the narrow channel ahead of them has become one of the most dangerous places on Earth. This is not a film. This is not a simulation. This is happening right now. And before this story is over, you are going to understand why oil markets across the planet are trembling, why global leaders are scrambling to contain a crisis that erupted almost overnight, and why the next 30 days could permanently reshape the balance of power across the Middle East. But the most shocking part of this entire story is something that very few people are discussing yet. And to understand it, we need to go back to the beginning. For years, Iran had been walking an incredibly delicate tightrope. On one side, the country was expanding its military capabilities. Uranium enrichment facilities continued to operate deep underground. Ballistic missile programs were advancing quietly but steadily. At the same time, Tehran maintained influence across the Middle East through a network of proxy groups stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. Organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis became part of a broader strategic web that allowed Iran to project power far beyond its borders. But on the other side of the tightrope, Iranian diplomats were sitting at negotiating tables in cities like Geneva and Vienna. There were talks, rounds of negotiations, promises of de-escalation, photographs of diplomats shaking hands and smiling for cameras. To the outside world, diplomacy appeared to be moving forward. But behind the scenes, intelligence agencies in Washington and Tel Aviv were watching everything. Satellite imagery was analyzed daily, communications were intercepted, facilities were mapped. And gradually, a picture began to emerge that deeply alarmed policymakers in both countries. By late February 2026, the United States and Israel had reached a conclusion. Diplomacy had failed, and the window to act was closing. On the night of February 27th, at precisely 2:30 a.m. Eastern Time, an 8-minute video appeared online. It was posted by Donald Trump on his social platform Truth Social. The message was direct and unusually blunt. Iran, he said, posed an existential threat to the United States and its allies. He accused the Iranian government of expanding nuclear capabilities, building long-range missile systems, and funding militant networks responsible for attacks on American forces across the region. And then he delivered the sentence that immediately sent shockwaves through the geopolitical world. "The lives of courageous American heroes may be lost," he said. "That often happens in war." By the time the video ended, the operation was already underway. Israel's military campaign carried the code name Operation Roaring Lion. The American operation was called Operation Epic Fury. Together, they formed one of the most coordinated military offensives the Middle East had seen in decades. Targets were struck across multiple Iranian cities: Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, Kermanshah, command centers, missile storage sites, military bases, facilities believed to be connected to Iran's nuclear program, all hit within hours. Stealth bombers from the United States flew deep into Iranian airspace. Precision-guided munitions targeted infrastructure that had taken years to build. Military analysts watching satellite imagery later described the strikes as surgical but overwhelming. And then something happened that changed the political landscape instantly. The supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, was killed. For more than 3 decades, he had been the most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic. Now, his compound lay in ruins. Within days, reports emerged that his wife had also died from injuries sustained during the strike. In one night, the leadership structure of one of the world's most influential theocratic regimes had been shattered. Iran's government scrambled to maintain control. Emergency meetings were held. Public mourning ceremonies were delayed. State media attempted to project stability. But behind closed doors, the situation was chaotic. Meanwhile, in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a message directly to the Iranian people during an interview. He urged citizens to take to the streets in massive numbers and challenge the government. It was a statement that hinted at something far larger than a military strike: regime change. But everyone watching the region knew something else as well. Iran does not absorb attacks quietly. Iran responds. And this time, the response came fast. Within hours of the initial strikes, Iran launched what it called Operation True Promise 4. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles were fired across the region. Targets appeared across 9 countries simultaneously: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel itself. American military bases came under fire. Israeli cities activated missile defense systems. Air raid sirens echoed across multiple capitals. But the most shocking development came when Iran began targeting energy infrastructure. Oil facilities in Saudi Arabia's eastern province were struck. Missiles fell near major airports in the Gulf. Debris from intercepted projectiles landed near Dubai's famous Palm Jumeirah development, sparking fires in nearby buildings. For the wealthy Gulf states that had long relied on stability and security guarantees, the message was unmistakable. No one in the region was untouchable anymore. The human cost was immediate. Deaths were reported in the United Arab Emirates. More casualties occurred in Kuwait. Jordan's air defenses intercepted dozens of incoming drones, though falling debris damaged buildings across the country. And in Lebanon, the powerful militant group Hezbollah opened another front by launching rockets toward northern Israel. The conflict was no longer limited to 2 countries. It had spread across the entire Middle East. But the most dangerous consequences were unfolding not on land, but at sea. Just off the coast of Oman, 2 commercial oil tankers were struck. The attacks did not sink the ships. But they sent a terrifying signal to every captain navigating the region. Insurance companies immediately reassessed risk. Shipping firms issued warnings. And within hours, roughly 150 vessels halted their journeys. They gathered near the entrance of one narrow waterway that controls the flow of global energy: the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, nearly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through this small corridor of water. Massive tankers carrying crude from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the UAE travel through it toward markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. Liquefied natural gas shipments also pass through the strait in enormous quantities. If the waterway closes, even temporarily, the consequences ripple through the global economy with extraordinary speed. Oil prices surge. Fuel costs rise. Airlines pay more for jet fuel. Manufacturing costs increase. Food prices climb because agriculture relies heavily on fuel and fertilizer derived from petroleum. Energy is embedded in almost every product humans consume, which means a disruption here affects nearly everyone on the planet. Financial markets reacted immediately. Stock indices dipped. Currencies in energy importing nations weakened. Countries heavily dependent on foreign oil, including India, Japan, Pakistan, and much of Europe, suddenly faced the possibility of a severe energy shock. Some economists began discussing scenarios where oil could climb past $100 per barrel if shipping disruptions continued. And the world economy today is far more fragile than it was during previous oil crises. Debt levels remain high after the pandemic. Central banks are already fighting inflation. A sudden spike in energy costs could push multiple economies towards stagflation, the dangerous combination of slow growth and rising prices. In other words, this war is not just a regional conflict. It is a potential global economic crisis. But while missiles were flying and markets were shaking, another major power was watching the situation very carefully. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin faced a strategic dilemma. Russia and Iran had signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement in early 2025. The two nations had expanded cooperation in trade, energy, and military technology. Iranian drones had been used by Russian forces in Ukraine. Russian engineers had helped construct nuclear reactors inside Iran. Billions of dollars in joint projects were underway. And suddenly, in a single weekend, Iran's leadership had been decapitated and its military infrastructure heavily damaged. Putin publicly condemned the killing of Khamenei. He described it as a violation of international law. He offered condolences to the Iranian government, but he stopped short of threatening military retaliation. And that restraint revealed something important. The Russia-Iran partnership did not include a formal mutual defense clause. Russia was not obligated to defend Iran militarily. And escalating directly against the United States would risk dragging Moscow into a confrontation it could not afford. Instead, the Kremlin adopted a careful strategy. Watch, wait, and benefit from rising oil prices that strengthen Russia's own energy exports. Yet even that strategy carries risks. If regime change eventually occurs in Tehran, a new government could move closer to the West. That would wipe out years of Russian investment and influence in the region, which means Moscow is not truly winning in this crisis. It is simply observing a dangerous gamble unfold. Meanwhile, inside the United States, political debates intensified. Some lawmakers questioned whether the strikes had been properly authorized. Senators demanded intelligence briefings. Discussions about war powers and congressional authority quickly began. And on the battlefield itself, the situation continued escalating. Thousands of casualties were reported across Iran. Military infrastructure was being destroyed daily. Iranian forces launched additional attacks on American bases. Naval clashes intensified in the Persian Gulf. The risk of accidental strikes near nuclear facilities began to alarm international monitoring organizations. Each passing day brought the conflict closer to a scenario that experts had feared for years, a regional war colliding with sensitive nuclear infrastructure. So where does this end? Right now? Nobody knows. Diplomats are scrambling. The United Nations Security Council has held emergency meetings. Regional governments are urging restraint, and thousands of foreign nationals are evacuating the Middle East as governments warn their citizens to leave immediately. All of this began with one pre-dawn strike. Within 5 days, it had expanded into a regional crisis involving multiple countries, frozen energy markets, and triggered military confrontations across land, air, and sea. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage that carries a fifth of the world's oil, remains under constant threat. And the decisions made in the coming days by leaders in Washington, Tehran, and Moscow could determine whether this war remains regional or becomes something far larger. The world has already changed this week. The only question now is how much further it will change before anyone decides to stop.